Um, Thank you all for being here. I wanted to, first of all, give a big shout out to our director of AADS, Dr. Noel Morissette, and our program coordinator, Kalia Carter, for making this happen. My very dear colleagues in the Afro-Latin American Studies and Afro-Latin American Latinx Consortium, of which we will surely be having new members off of this presentation. And today, what we're talking about is basically Afro-Peru, from colonial times to the present. And it's my great pleasure, being Peruvian on one side of my family, Indian from the other, to have two wonderful colleagues in the field, scholars and practitioners and activists who are doing meaningful work in their different areas. And so I will introduce them, and also just another shout out to my co-coordinators, our lead coordinator, Professor Nodia Mena and Ana Hontanilla, who have been just sort of champions in taking this idea of bringing together people who are doing work on Afro-Latin America together. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. So today, I have the pleasure of introducing to you two outstanding colleagues. I will begin with Monica. Monica Carrillo Zegara is a Peruvian journalist, poet, singer, and activist, noted for her fight for human rights of Afro descendant communities in Peru. I actually first saw Monica in a documentary that was by Harvard University's Skip Gates, and then later on had a chance to meet her in Peru. And then we met up again in New York, which was wonderful. She's the founder of Lundu, Center for Afro-Peruvian Studies, an organization that works to promote recognition and respect for the Afro-Peruvian community from a feminist perspective, as well as to combat racism and all forms of discrimination. She holds multiple degrees. She holds a Master of Fine Arts with a specialty in performance, media, and interactive arts from the City University of New York. She has also studied social communication at Universidad Nacional Mayor de San Marcos with a specialty in journalism, and she has studied international law at Oxford University. If that isn't enough, she also has a diploma in political journalism and cultural analysis from the Ruiz de Montoya University. As part of her work on social justice, Monica promotes the importance of fundamental human rights, including sexual and reproductive rights, while working in her community and internationally to defend the rights of the Afro-Peruvian population, women, and youth. Her life and career was featured in the documentary for MTV Europe in 2007. As a poet, she's published the book Unicroma and the album Unicroma, as she's composed and recited her poems for the Latin Grammy, and she's done many, many things, including participating in the album Carimba, and among other things, and composed lyrics in Spanish for the song El Pie de Enamorada on the Bossa Loca album. As a researcher, she's published the book Faces of Violence, Faces of Power, among other publications. And let me just say that I cannot think of a more important and powerful ambassador of the plight of Afro-Peruvians and people of African descent in South America. You'll be hearing from her shortly, so you'll see what I mean. So I will next introduce our colleague, Dan Cozart. Dr. Cozart completed his MA in Latin American Studies at UNC Charlotte, and then completed his PhD in Latin American History at the University of New Mexico in 2017. He's been teaching full-time load as an adjunct professor of history and Latin American Studies at UNC Charlotte since 2015. His areas of concentration are race and ethnicity in modern Latin America, inter-American relations and revolutions, and social movements in modern Latin America. His research combines these areas with a focus on Afro-Peruvian history from the abolition of slavery through the mid-20th century. And what I thought we would do is have maybe Dan start off, and then we'll go to Monica, and then we'll open things up. Monica has been speaking for the last hour, so we'll give her a tiny bit of a break here. And I think also Dan's work is more historical, although Monica's is as well. So I think there's a kind of a logic to that. So with that, Dan, why don't you kick us off and you can share screen whenever you're ready.
Great. Thank you so much, Omar, for the introduction. It's an honor to be a part of this roundtable with Monica Carrillo, whose work I'm familiar with. And really, I really appreciate everyone's work in putting this great conference together. I want to begin by thanking again Omar Ali, also Nodia Mena, Kalia Carter, and the African American African Diaspora Studies Department at UNC Greensboro for putting this great panel together. I'll try to be as brief as possible. I'm going to be talking about my book project, which is titled Afro-Peruvian Creoles, the Disappearance and Persistence of the People through Mestizaje. So let me go ahead and share my first slide. Okay, perfect. And I'll begin by explaining how I became interested in this topic. Which was actually my first year as a graduate student at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte in 2008. One of the first books I read was the autobiography of Maria Elena Moyano, The Life and Death of Peruvian Activists. And this book and her interlocutor, Diana Miloslavich Tupac, were published in 1993, just a year after she was assassinated by revolutionaries of the Shining Path movement. And I was blown away by this book, to put it simply. Because first of all, the matter of her death was horrific, but also I had never heard about this unique Afro-Peruvian identity prior to reading this book. So I decided to investigate the topic further, and I read some classic works on slavery in colonial Peru, beginning with Frederick Bowser's 1974 book, The African Slave in Colonial Peru, which focuses on the early colonial period and points out that enslaved African people were among the first explorers and with the first company of conquistadors with Francisco Pizarro to arrive to the Inca Empire in Peru in the 1520s and the 1530s. Yet I had trouble finding literature beyond this book and another book, which is on the following screen. We can go to the next slide. By historian Peter Blanchard, titled Slavery and Abolition in Early Republican Peru. And the scope of his book was focused on the independence era through the 1850s when slavery was abolished in a decree by Caudillo Ramon Castilla in December of 1854. And that law went into effect after he won a battle in a war against the rival Caudillo Rufino Echenique that same year, and it went into effect again in 1855. And both of these books made really important contributions to the history of enslaved people in Peru and Afro-Peruvian history more generally. Yet there was an opening that I noticed here regarding Afro-Peruvian history following the abolition of slavery that I was really intrigued to find out more about. And I decided to dive further into the topic. And of course, I came across the work of Carlos Aguirre, who thankfully and graciously was an outside member of my dissertation committee when I was doing the dissertation at the University of New Mexico. His book, Agentes de su propia libertad, which was published in 1995, is one of many books and a great deal of research that he's produced on the history of slavery and abolition in 19th century Peru as well, which I think does a particularly good job of incorporating Afro-Peruvian agency and culture in helping people understand how this culture has survived throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. That I think provides perhaps a better detailed analysis than the first two historical works I read by Blanchard and Bowser. The reason I was a bit uneasy with what I had read prior to reading Aguirre's work was that both Blanchard and Bowser reported that Afro-Peruvians following in the national era and after the abolition of slavery simply adopted whitening strategies through mestizaje and jettisoned their blackness, so to speak, to improve their social position, improving society. That seemed like an incomplete explanation to me. Um, and I was curious to find out more about the supposed disappearance. So, of course, I also read a book published in 2006 that's perhaps the best known book on Afro-Peruvian history and culture by ethnomusicologist Heidi Carolyn Feldman called Black Rhythms of Peru, reviving African musical heritage in the Black Pacific. There are a number of reasons I really love this book, particularly her emphasis on Afro-Peruvian cultural contributions from the 1950s through the 1970s. Um, the Santa Cruz siblings, Victoria and Nicomedes, who had a profound impact in this revival that began in the 1950s. But she also reported in this book that, and also is echoing the work of Blanchard and Bowser, in reporting that in the early colonial period, by the mid 17th century, Afro-descended peoples, freed blacks and enslaved Africans alike along coastal Peru came to outnumber whites. Were essentially the majority population of coastal Peru by 1650. Yet, by the year 1940, the final 20th century census to include racial data or race labels, as I call them in my manuscript, that number had dwindled to less than 0.5%. And this made me even more curious, of course, to find out what exactly happened here, and to challenge this, what I thought was rather simplistic narrative of cultural assimilation and whitening. Right? So I decided to dive into the topic of mestizaje, or racial mixing, in more depth. And this is what brought me to the topic of my dissertation, which was aimed at first of all, uncovering the process by which the Afro-Peruvian population was rendered invisible from the late colonial period, and specifically from the abolition of slavery until the year 1940. So I'm looking at the years between 1855 and 1940. And I had a lot of trouble when I got to the archives in Peru. Um, for one reason, as a white North American male, as an outsider, looking at the question of race in Peru. But also because in many of the archives, both in Lima, the National Archives, and even along the northern coast in Piura, where I spent a great deal of time, there is an absence of race labels in many of the records I was looking at, including notarial records, and in some cases even baptismal records and internment records. There was a lack of racial markers that made uncovering this history particularly difficult.
Dr. Cozart, I just have to interrupt for 1 second. There was a concern about your voice not being very clear. What I had to do to the person who's having trouble is I just had to increase the volume significantly more.
Okay,
so
thanks for letting me know. Make sure. I also have a headset that with a microphone that might make things better.
Why don't you try that? Let's see if that's better, because it is a little choppy and muffled.
Sure, I'm switching over here. Is it coming through any better now? I'm not sure if it's going to automatically connect to my.
I'm not sure if it's that different. Let's see. But what I had to do to whoever said that just is I increased the volume.
Okay, I'll keep it on and see if it gives me the option of.
Okay. Sorry to interrupt your flow there.
No, perfectly fine. Of course, I want to make sure people can hear me.
Yeah. If you go to Zoom and preferences, they are going to give you a video, and maybe you need to in the audio.
Now I can select
microphone, and I just selected my headset microphone. So is that?
Oh yeah.
Way better. Okay. Way better.
I use this when I'm teaching, but I don't normally use Zoom. So
that's great. Thank you, Monica.
Yes, thank you all very much. Okay, I'm glad you pointed that out. This helped me to develop my research questions, which first of all were to investigate this process by which the Afro-descended population of Peru was rendered invisible between 1855 and 1940. And also, when I first arrived to Lima, I decided to investigate in the archives, the National Archives, but also the Instituto Nacional de Estadística Informática, which houses a number of census records, as well as the municipal archives of Lima, which hold local records, archival records, and census records for neighborhoods and callejones in Lima at the very local level. And I was curious to see if those numbers were correct as reported in Feldman's book, and sure enough, they were. So of course, I had to find other sources to find out other narratives about this process, and I decided to focus on the dominant narrative of mestizaje. If we can go to the next slide, I'll be able to share with you, I think, the basic outline of my manuscript. So I have three overarching sections in terms of how I've organized the manuscript, and I can speak more to the chapters within each section in the Q&A after our discussion. But this provides a basic background a basic outline and overview of the work of my manuscript that I'm working on. So the first section examines the invisibility of Afro-Peruvians in historical scholarship and in the census records themselves, especially in the secondary literature up until the 1970s, beginning with Bowser's work. And this is where the title of the book gets its name, Criollos Afro-Peruanos, or Afro-Peruvian Creoles. In the first chapter, I interrogate the etymology of the term Creole and find that it's something of a misnomer, or it results from mistranslation from Latin American scholarship in the early 17th century, and Anglo scholarship that translated the term criollo to mean a European born of the Indies. Yet, of course, that term, as it was used in Peru, was quite different. It meant, especially among enslaved Afro-descended people in Peru, a person who was born in the New World, and could be a reference to people of any race or ethnicity, right? So, I find, of course, some differences in terms of this dominant narrative of whitening and invisibility beginning in this first chapter. I'm also looking at the official reports that accompanied censuses from the 1870s through 1940 that provide some really interesting perspectives on, or at least the elite perspectives on how they classified people according to race and the methodologies that they used to categorize people according to different race labels, which ultimately show that they increased the category of mestizo or mestiza over these years and limited categories indicating African ancestry. And I argue this was something that resulted from the dominant narrative of mestizaje that, of course, held up the mestizo identity and whiteness, and of course further disintegrated and denigrated African ancestry and blackness. So in my second section, I examine elite constructions of Afro-Peruvian identity with the rise of nationalism, in which I analyze patriotic newspapers that emerged in 1860s Lima, as well as literature published in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that also show counter-hegemonic narratives regarding mestizaje. So I'm looking at the work from Piura and comparing it to work emanating from Lima, from both elites who embraced the pseudoscience of race, but also those like Ricardo Palma, who in some complex and contradictory ways promoted Afro-Peruvian culture as part of the national identity, as well as work from Piura that I think did this in a more sincere way. And I can talk to the examples of literature I'm looking at in our Q&A as well after my brief presentation. Finally, in my third section, which was the most challenging, I think, to research and to write, I'm analyzing Afro-Peruvian collective identities that have been maintained in small coastal communities, as well as Afro-Peruvian participation in broader social and political movements in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And I argue that this Afro-Peruvian political agency has been largely overlooked in the historiography of modern Peru due to the absence of race labels in the language of the archival records themselves. So this was a challenge because I had to triangulate a variety of sources, including official records from the National Archives in Peru, but also in looking at local records in the Afro-Peruvian museums of the small towns of Sanya and Yapatera along the north coast to locate Afro-Peruvian roles in broader social movements, especially in the labor movement that had major successes in the 19 teens. So if you go to the next slide, I can provide some photographs that I took of, these are two photographs I took in the Museo Afro-Peruano de Yapatera, which is a small Afro-Peruvian community in northern Piura, outside of the town of Chulucanas. And I wanted to share this because it's quite a difference from the Museo Nacional Afro-Peruana in Lima, because it really highlights the African roots of Peru's Afro-Peruvian identities. And as you see on the left, there's a huge painting of Nelson Mandela and a quote from him about the sacrifice it takes to promote justice and social change. And the image on the right is an image of the cepo, which was a device that was used to torture enslaved Afro-Peruvian people in the national era and through the colonial period as well. And above that, this museum includes an accurate map of the African origins of and also of the transatlantic slave trade, or the Middle Passage, throughout the colonial period, to show the origins of Afro-Latin Americans and Afro-Americans throughout the Americas. And I highlight this photo on the right because this image of the cepo, that was something that I saw in the Museum of Sanya as well. I don't recall seeing it in the National Museum of Lima. I could be mistaken there, but it's interesting because, of course, this is meant to highlight the suffering of Afro-Peruvians and promote, of course, a sense of shared suffering and the legacies of slavery that Afro-Peruvians continue to confront into the present day, which I think Monica Carrillo can speak to in her presentation as well. So if we move along to the next slide, I want to highlight one key point, and this will be my final point for today, for my presentation, which is a document that I found in La Hemeroteca, or the periodical archives in the National Archives in Lima, which was a publication that was directed by Jose Carlos Mariátegui, perhaps Peru's most famous Marxist scholar of the 20th century, who directed the periodical known as El Amauta, which generally focused on the indigenous population. And his work, I analyze in a lot of detail in my manuscript because it's quite contradictory with regard to the Afro-Peruvian population, which in some cases he denigrated and spoke poorly of. Yet in the same journal, we have this publication that appeared in 1928, which I argue was an example of Black internationalism, in this case emanating from Lima, Peru. And I want to highlight just a few key points that really struck me when I found this document. And on the following slide, I have the original in Spanish as well, if we want to share that. But for now, I'll just go through the English. So, of course, the first one, struggle against all forms of chauvinism, against all aims of postponing economic, political, and social problems for questions of race. Struggle against any and all forms of slavery, of course. And D connects pretty well with a lot of what I cover in the book regarding Afro-Peruvian patriotism and their efforts in national wars throughout the 19th century, which criticizes how they had been manipulated by Creole elites in the 19th century, especially in the War of the Pacific and in a war against Spain in the 1860s. And the others I'd like to highlight, example G was a signal success and victory for the Peruvian labor movement, which was achieved in 1919, the struggle for the workday of 8 hours. And so this is an example of how Afro-Peruvians, I would argue, were seeking to expand this success on a more global scale. And finally, the last example, the ninth example I'll point to here, letter I think provides crucial insights to the struggles that Afro-Peruvians faced within the labor movement itself, in the sense that they were promoting a struggle against all barriers relating to race within the labor unions, the organization of an international labor union based in class struggle that understands the working masses of all countries and of all races. This one I think is key because it provides some clues to help us understand why Afro-Peruvian agency in the labor movement itself is so hard to uncover, and why it was difficult for me to uncover this, because it appears that Afro-Peruvians were marginalized within the labor movement itself. Yet by triangulating a variety of sources, I'm able to show, I think, that they were central to the successes of the labor movement, and this helped consolidate a set of shared common interests between Lima and the North Coast. So I'll stop here and turn it over to Monica. And thank you for your time again. I look forward to the questions in the discussion that will follow.
Great. Thank you, Dan. Monica.
Bueno, voy a hablar en español, ¿está bien?
Sí, está bien.
Ok, puedo hablar en inglés, pero siempre es bueno tener la oportunidad de hablar en español. Más
Claro.
hablando sobre Perú.
Quizás, Mónica, de vez en cuando podamos discutir algunas cositas en inglés, porque creo que una parte de los que están mirando eso no entienden español, entonces...
Ok.
Yeah.
Ok, claro, sí, puedo ser. Bueno, tal vez podrá comenzar. ¿Puedo compartir mi pantalla desde aquí?
Creo que sí.
Sí, ok,
Sí.
acá. ¿Me están viendo, no?
Sí.
Ok, perfecto. Déjame verla como pantalla completa. Un minuto. ¿Ahora sí se ve la pantalla completa? Ok, bueno, una de las cosas que es importante siempre y me gusta recordar es lo que también Dan ha mencionado, creo que en su primer o segunda slide, sobre cuál es la experiencia o la particularidad de los afroperuanos y cuáles son aquellas características que nos hacen tan diferentes en términos culturales con las experiencias más cercanas a Estados Unidos, como puede ser la migración del Caribe, la migración haitiana, cubana, y de otros países de Centroamérica o del Caribe. Y una de las cosas importantes que siempre vale la pena recordar, y creo que este mapa ayuda a identificar cuál es la ubicación geográfica y geopolítica del Perú. Este mapa de Latinoamérica, ustedes pueden ver que Perú es el país que es un poco larguito al lado izquierdo, y ustedes pueden ver que en la geografía esa línea marrón que cruza Latinoamérica, Suramérica, es básicamente la cordillera de los Andes, ¿no? Y la parte verde, la muy, muy, muy verde, es el Amazonas. ¿Y por qué es importante entender? Porque el hecho de que nuestra presencia en esta parte del mundo ha estado básicamente ubicada en las zonas costeras, en la línea muy delgada que ustedes ven entre el mar y la parte marrón. ¿Por qué es importante entender esto? Porque, como mencionaba en el panel anterior, esto es un ejemplo de este segundo viaje, ¿no? Hay un primer viaje, que es este viaje cruzando el Atlántico, donde los africanos que llegaban, por ejemplo, a través de Cartagena, a través de Brasil, podían de alguna manera establecer a veces una conexión con los otros países del Atlántico Negro. Y eso también se transformaba en conexiones políticas, ¿no? Saber sobre la revolución de Haití, saber qué pasaba en Cuba, pero para nosotros, ubicados en esta parte del mundo, no era posible establecer esa comunicación, esa conexión. Y a su vez...
Mónica, paramos un segundito para decir en inglés. Okay, I'll take a shot. So really looking at how, so Monica is talking about how Afro-Peruvians are different from African Americans and Afro-Caribbean folks, and that the geography there is, we're talking about really the sliver on the coast being Afro-Peruvian populated, although there is also a presence interior, we know, with Bolivia and the mining work there. And that part of what we're trying to understand is the specificity of the Afro-Peruvian experience, which is the transatlantic crossing, not included just the transatlantic, but then going across to the Pacific. And there is a disconnect, with a further disconnect from Africa, or a challenge in connecting back to Africa. So maybe that's a little bit of a summary.
Perfecto, sí. Eso es un elemento que hasta el día de hoy ha configurado nuestros procesos culturales de mestizajes y también procesos políticos. Y hablo de mestizaje más también relacionado a lo que Dan mencionaba sobre lo criollo, lo que se entiende como criollo en el caso de Perú, en el caso de la costa, es la mezcla entre blancos, africanos y de alguna manera indígenas, pero en menor proporción. Entonces, la experiencia del mestizaje criolla no necesariamente ha tenido este mestizaje con otros afrodescendientes, como sí se ha dado, por ejemplo, en Cartagena, donde llegaban afrodescendientes de lo que era Venezuela o de lo que ahora es Panamá. En el caso de nosotros, la cultura del mestizaje ha sido desde lo afro hacia lo blanco y hacia lo indígena, y no con otros afrodescendientes de otras partes de Latinoamérica o del Caribe.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, so the demographics is different in Peru because you don't have as much of a mix of people coming on the African mix, coming in from other parts of South America into, say, like in Cartagena, which is facing the Caribbean. In Peru, there's less mixture. Would that be a way of describing it among the Africans there with the European white and also indigenous population, which is really large in Peru?
Uh-huh. Otro elemento importante se relaciona con el censo y con el número de población afroperuana. Nosotros como movimiento afroperuano luchamos para que se incorpore una pregunta censal que incorpore la variable afroperuana. Eso se logró después de muchos años, recientemente en el 2017, y como resultado de ese censo se ha identificado que existen 828.594 afroperuanos o personas que se han reconocido como afroperuanas, o sea, menos de 1 millón de personas.
So it wasn't until about 2017 that the government finally had census that included people of African descent, people who could self-identify as Afro-Peruvian, which was a fight that took many, many years. And right now, just under 1 million people self-identify as Afro-Peruvian.
¿Y por qué es importante entender esto? Porque la estrategia política que tuvimos ha sido desde el año 2001 hasta acá, al menos desde mi posición y desde la posición del movimiento de la cual yo soy parte, es utilizar el término afrodescendiente como identidad marco y después afroperuano. ¿Por qué? Porque con el término identitario afrodescendiente, una persona se conecta con la herencia africana y no entra en la compleja identidad relacionada con el color de la piel. Es decir, si es que nosotros seguimos con el discurso de lo negro y estamos en un proceso de tanto mestizaje, lo negro queda fuera porque lo negro es una identidad, pero también apela a algo visible del color. Pero si incorporamos la visión afrodescendiente, hay mucho más espacio para que las personas se autoidentifiquen, porque es una manera mucho más positiva inclusive, porque te conectas no a un color, sino a un continente, África.
This is super interesting, everybody. Okay, so basically, since 2001, the political strategy has been to basically assert the African descendants as opposed to Black descendants, because it's a much more, it can incorporate a much larger grouping of people, because not everybody who is of African descent phenotypically appears Black. So in some ways, it's a way of capturing a larger portion and in some ways allowing people to assert their identity in a way that makes more sense, as opposed to saying Black, because people might say, well, you don't look Black. ¿Algo así?
Sí, perfecto. Y otro componente también va a entender que el número que nosotros tenemos ahora de 900,000 personas no necesariamente es un número realista, porque hay muchas personas que no se autoidentifican, ¿no?, como afrodescendientes, a pesar de serlo, básicamente por un tema racial o de racismo, ¿no? Ahí puedo agregar otra parte, ¿no?, que uno de los trabajos que yo he estado haciendo y con el colectivo ha sido la generación de estadísticas, porque tú tienes que generar estadísticas cuando alguien se identifica, ¿no? Entonces, ustedes saben que la gran tensión dentro del tema racial y estadístico es si el encuestador mira y decide poner el checklist de Black o si la persona dice, yo soy afro. Entonces, hay una tensión constante, hay problemas políticos, ¿no?, siempre en quién decide, Y nuestra propuesta es la autoafirmación, pero eso implica sacrificar años hasta que las personas puedan ellos mismos asumirse. O sea, en resumen, no es que ese número sea para nosotros el real, somos muchos más que 900,000.
So the numbers of people of African descent is clearly much more than 900,000 or just under 1 million people. And part of what the fight has been is to, in some ways, organize people to self-identify of African descent. And there's a tension between essentially census takers who want to identify the people and also the people self-identifying themselves. So it was a sacrifice to go that route. But ultimately, I think it probably will yield a greater sense of autonomy and actually sort of self-empowerment, it seems. Yeah.
Sí. Bueno, bueno, esto es solamente un mapa del Atlántico Negro para que un poco puedan ver la posibilidad de alguna manera de conexión entre los países que están en esta parte del mundo y nosotros, los peruanos, que estamos en el otro lado. Solamente es eso.
So you see all the different kinds of people that are connected in the Caribbean and the Circum-Caribbean, which is very different from sort of the relative isolation of Afro-Peruvians, which are down the coast. I mean, there is a presence in Ecuador, but it's much further down.
Otro de los temas importantes, y yo creo que ya se aplica a toda la política sobre temas raciales, es que en el caso de los afrodescendientes de Latinoamérica, nosotros somos los que hemos liderado la batalla y la agenda racial, ¿no? En Latinoamérica. Los otros movimientos indígenas, entre otros, la han liderado, bajo mi perspectiva, más desde el aspecto territorial y los efectos de la colonización, ¿no? Pero nosotros, este tema de colonización la sentimos a partir del racismo. Entonces tú tienes en Latinoamérica, si realmente analizas cómo la agenda de la justicia racial es liderada por afrodescendientes, y creo que en el caso de los indígenas, la agenda está más liderada por el anticolonialismo y temas de territorialidad.
So there is a distinction that's important that between the movements, indigenous movements, versus the African descended movements. The indigenous ones have been much more focused on sort of anti-colonial and also disputes over territory. And African descended peoples in Peru have been fighting sort of anti-racism. And so they have played the leadership role in terms of combating against racism, which there's a connection there, but there's definitely a leadership role that Afro-Peruvians and Afro-descended peoples across Latin America play in terms of anti-racism struggle.
Pero hay un cambio en los últimos 20 o 30 años en la agenda, porque muchos afrodescendientes, más afrocolombianos, por ejemplo, están asumiendo la agenda territorial debido a el interés por las riquezas, ¿no?, de los territorios, al igual que los pueblos garífunas. Pero esa agenda territorial de autonomía no era tan importante como hace 60, 70, 80 años, ¿no?, porque era más indígena. Ahora hay como un encuentro, ¿no?, entre la agenda política afro, que está comenzando a incluir el territorio, y que antes no la tenía de manera tan fuerte como ahora.
Yeah, so in the last 20 years, there's been a shift in terms of the political agenda among Afro-Peruvian activists, which has been to actually adopt some of the territorial claims that indigenous people have been fighting for some time. So there's an overlap there now.
Y otro elemento tiene que ver, que es sobre Perú, pero se expande el tema de la reforma agraria. No todos los países en Latinoamérica tuvieron reforma agraria. En el caso de Perú sí hubo reforma agraria, pero no hubo reforma agraria en Brasil, en Colombia. Entonces, la agenda de Perú no ha sido territorial porque en el gobierno de Velasco Alvarado, el gobierno militar, él dio los territorios a los campesinos, y los afroperuanos llegamos a tener propiedad de nuestras tierras. Y esa nos marca de manera muy diferente con la agenda afrocolombiana, afrobrasilera y otras agendas.
Yeah, big distinction is there was under the military dictatorship, this is now going back almost 40 years, there was a agrarian reform in Peru that you don't see in other places like in Brazil or in Colombia. And so Afro-descended peoples actually did get a level of territory, a modicum of territory that others, it turns out they didn't and didn't have access to. So there's different, it's a different fight among Afro-Peruvians.
Sí, ok. Esa es solamente una foto del lugar de donde es toda mi familia, que es el Carmen en Chincha. Es un desierto, es una zona conquistada como valle, pero es un desierto natural, la zona de Ica, de Nazca. ¿Y por qué lo menciono? Porque esta característica geográfica de desierto ha demarcado mucho los procesos de mestizaje y los procesos de organización social, porque nosotros, en un contexto así, era difícil la conformación de quilombos o de palenques, porque si corres, vas a ser siempre descubierto porque tienes el horizonte, a diferencia de los afrodescendientes ubicados en otros contextos como Esmeraldas en Brasil, Esmeraldas en Ecuador, Palmares en Brasil, etcétera, etcétera. Entonces, el hecho que estemos en la costa y en esa costa desértica ha demarcado mucho nuestra historia y lo que somos ahora.
Super interesante. So this is really interesting, and I had never thought of this. So there's also a really important distinction between basically what you see in terms of maroon societies in Brazil, Palenque, in Colombia as well, or Esmeraldas, which are actually much more surrounded by forest. Here, the Afro-Peruvian population, which is again on that coast, is actually in a lot of desert area. So her family comes from this area in Chincha, which is basically a very desert, it's a desert area. And so it had a different impact. Like you couldn't hide in the forest as many African enslaved peoples did to gain their freedom. So it produced a different dynamic. So as you're beginning to see, Monica is laying out that there's really different demographic, sort of geographic differences that have shaped the trajectory of political organization among Afro-Peruvians.
Y bueno, tengo 5 minutos más para terminar las ideas, solamente para saber cuánto tiempo tengo. ¿5?
5 minutos, ya.
Ya, ok, perfecto. Entonces, bueno, como saben, yo soy poeta. Voy a solamente compartirles una frase de un poema que se llama Carrera de la Cimarrona, donde yo escribo sobre esta, como yo lo llamo, angustia epistemológica de como persona afro, estar en un lugar que es tan diferente, que es esto y que no es monte y qué cosa pasará. Entonces, este es un poema que yo escribí y que lo he hecho en canción. Solamente la entrada está en inglés, o sea que yo lo voy a decir en español y ustedes lo van a leer en inglés si el inglés está bien. Dice así: corre, fuga, salta, araña, llegaste al monte, nadaste el río, el verde del pájaro bobo te envuelve. Aquí no hay selva como en Palmares, tampoco los ríos de esmeraldas. Aquí la pampa te pega el polvo en las narices. ¿A dónde iré si hay cordillera? Un horizonte que me descubre, confío y rezo, orado el cerro, invento un oasis, pero no vuelvo. Primero asalto, asusto y mato, como mis heces, y me alimento, y me alimento. El perro ladra. Huele mis pasos, ya no retengo ni mis respiros, ya no retengo ni mis respiros, todo lo dejo, en el camino, para que cuando me muerda el anca, no reconozca mi cuerpo esclavo. No reconozca mi cuerpo esclavo, porque si muero entre sus dientes, moriré libre y no liberada por alguna gracia. Él ya escapó y no volvió. Quizá me espera y sueña verme, quizá me espera y sueña verme, tal vez la pierna que llevó el perro hacia la hacienda no era de él. Quizá el destino nos acompañe, quizá el destino nos acompañe. El perro ladra. Aquí no hay selva. Llegué hacia un río que va hacia el mar. No puedo más. No, no, no puedo más. Son muchos días y ya no hay fuerzas. Mi dulce Orula, ¿por qué me llevas sin esperanzas? Ya no hay consuelo en esta vida, ya no hay consuelo en esta vida. Veo al cielo atormentado por mi partida. Bueno,
Súper,
gracias
súper.
por escuchar. Puedo igual luego en la parte de la conversación hablar más sobre el tema político, porque esa es la otra parte. Para nosotros como afrodescendientes, el gran problema es que nuestra agenda suele ser cooptada para hablar solo de tema racial y de defensa contra el racismo, pero tienes la otra agenda política, la agenda de acción afirmativa, o solo la agenda que nos hagan a nosotros alcanzar derechos y respetos como todos los seres humanos, pero estamos realmente forzados a centrarnos en la agenda racial, y yo creo que esos dos lados es importante, ¿no? Agenda racial, pero ¿qué es lo que nosotros queremos conseguir como pueblo, como gente? Entonces, puedo hablar más de eso en la segunda parte o cuando conversemos si desean. Gracias.
Ya, muchas gracias a ti. So there's this tension in terms of, do you focus on sort of anti-racism, or do you focus on basic civil rights? Are those two connected? But there's a way in which there's a feeling of like you have to do one or the other. And so Monica is trying to do all of the above, actually. So I think that what we can do now is maybe open things up. If folks want to ask a question, we have about just over 20 minutes, which is a nice amount of time. But let me get things started and say that I really appreciate both of your presentations. I find, Dan, you're being sort of articulating the historiography. What is it the scholars have done, complementing well sort of the epistemologies that Monica has been giving expression to, which is the self-expression of Afro-descendant peoples, or people like her who are both scholars and also artists and activists. But to go back, there are some real distinctions between Afro-Peruvian experiences and say Afro-Colombians or Afro-Brazilians. Dan, when you listen to Monica speaking, how does it make you think differently, or does it simply reinforce what you see in terms of the more traditional academic scholarship that goes back to Frank Browser and others, before him? I mean, there's a tradition that goes back among Peruvians before Browser's work. And then I want to ask, in some ways, Monica, the same question about, which comes from the last panel, which is you were raising the question of a different epistemology among Afro-descended peoples. So how do you articulate a different epistemology than what has been traditionally described by sort of people who are coming from outside, if you will? So Dan, if you want to maybe kick us off and we can talk a little bit about that. And if I need to clarify, please do, because I'm trying to formulate my thoughts as I'm speaking.
No, thank you very much for the opportunity. Tengo piel de gallo. Goosebumps after that poem. It was beautiful. And it does resonate actually with a lot of research and other poetry that I found, especially along the North Coast with regard to La Décima de Pie Forzado, right? And which has become kind of a cultural icon of Afro-Peruvian contributions to the national culture. So I think I really appreciate Monica sharing her poetry with us, for one thing, but also I also appreciate her perspective, which does highlight the unique history of Afro-Peruvian people, right? And show that it is in fact quite a different history and quite a different historical experience than the African diaspora in other parts of Latin America. was actually trained by a Brazilianist at New Mexico. So I'm really intrigued, and her work focuses on the African diaspora in Brazil, which is so different from when we study the history of Afro-Peru, right? For all these reasons that I think Monica is pointing to so well. At the same time, I think that there have been political dimensions of Afro-Peruvian cultural contributions that have been generally overlooked. And that's something that I'm trying to uncover and kind of read against the grain and the decimas that I've found, especially in the communities of Sanya and Yapatera, where if you look at examples of collections of decimas there, which have it's a unique form of oral history, for one thing, and also cultural expression in Peru. If you contextualize the production of these poems with historical events, such as the War of the Pacific, I found examples of Afro-Peruvian poetry in these decimas that have been recorded and written down in some collections. I have one right here, actually, that I'll hold up from Sanya by Hildebrando Birones Vela, known as El Candil del Norte, no? And as for one example, I think that touches on Monica's point really well, is a poem that una décima, that he titled Discriminación. You probably can't see it well if I hold it up, but he and other decimistas have actually shared this décima, and it's been published in a variety of different pamphlets like this in northern Peru. And it's an example of kind of this perceived need to focus the Afro-Peruvian agenda on fighting racism, right? As she points out, I think really accurately. But other poetry within the same volume also emphasizes the role of Afro-Peruvians in history that's been generally overlooked in the more official narratives, right? So this official narrative of disappearance and invisibility overlooks a great deal of Afro-Peruvian agency that existed prior to the so-called revival in the 1950s, right? So I'm hoping that by contextualizing work like this a bit better as a historian, we can perhaps uncover more of Afro-Peruvian agency historically and show that although it's Afro-Peruvian activists face unique challenges, right? That there is a history of Afro-Peruvian activism that has been both anti-racist and political, in the sense that it was part of broader social movements that actually affected major change in the Peruvian labor movement and in popular politics as well. So my one example I would point to would be the APRA party, right? El Partido Aprista Peruano, which I'm hoping to research in further detail in the future. But if we look at where this party has been most popular, of course, there was one photo in my slide of the APRA party's office in Sanya. And that was where I really wanted to go in, but no one was there when I was there. And there are other offices there that house this kind of archival material that even if those archives don't specifically state the race of the people or the ethno-racial identity of the people who were taking action against the aristocracy, as it's come to be known in the early 20th century, who were essentially the inheritors of the planter class, the slaveholding elite in the early 19th century, we can still see that these were examples of Afro-Peruvians expressing their political and social agency, right? And still, it seems like it's a double struggle, right? Kind of a two-sided front for Afro-Peruvians historically and into the present day to fight both racism and also fight this narrative of invisibility to assert their centrality in the nation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dan. Yeah, thank you. I wanted to share that also. Monica has been a unbelievably courageous warrior for the rights and Afro-descended peoples in Peru. I can't overstate it. I mean, she would move around with bodyguards for a while because there was such vicious sort of attacks on her work. So in some ways, when we talk about political struggle, and we think about sort of course, anti-slavery struggles that we think in the past, but actually it's one thing to note, and maybe Monica, you can speak to this as part of the conversation, is that in some ways, it's very recent that some of the most egregious forms of racism was appearing on television, on primetime television, and it was just seen as like totally okay. Things that were happening in the United States, for instance, literally 70 years ago, 80 years ago, were being portrayed as of only about 10, 15 years ago, and she was involved in various legal fights as well. But maybe Monica, you can respond to any of the above.
Sure, and just to respond to that it's easy for me to share my screen.
Yeah.
Could you see my screen? No?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So, sure. So, there were two questions. Maybe first I will start talking about the second part. As I mentioned it, we as Afro-descendants people, Afro-Peruvian people, we need to have a strategy, a long-term strategy, because we are just living under a structure that was built along 200 or 400 years. So we need to have this something that some people call paciencia histórica, no? Paciencia histórica. And of course, it's not easy because you need just to live every day, but if you take that decision, okay, you just need to be mature to plan your life for the next 20 years or 15 at least, if you want to see a real transformation. This is something that we did as a collective, at least with my group. So one of the main important strategies that we had was, okay, it's very obvious that people are racist, but they don't believe that it's true, just create evidence. So I designed a methodology called Afro-Peruvian Observatory, that when we analyzed 11,000 editions of newspaper along 7 years, every single day we bought 4 newspapers, we review, and we did a report. That report was a monthly report, a semestral report, and an annual report, and we organized a press conference to talk about how were the representations of Afro-Peruvians and Africans in the Peruvian media. So with that is the evidence. We also did a legal case. So I was a legal representative of a case against a blackface on TV, a trial that was a very big case against a blackface that was on TV for 12 years. So, but here is just an example of the revision of 1 year, no? This is how we create some categories of analysis, how many racist articles, how many adjectives, racist adjectives on against women, against men, and also about comics, no? And this is just an example. Like it's more interesting for me just to show the Peruvian newspapers, as you can see, are calling Monada, like doing a very specific connection with monkeys, gorillas, black kids that also have the sexual connotance and tone. You have this, for example, no? There is like about Negritos tienen hija rubia, King Kong, Black Beast, and we create sections when we create like a collage of the newspapers separated by gender, by topic. So this is just an example about why for us was important to create evidence to organize our political campaigns. But this also was a very important material for academics and for students, no? So this is one of the characters, no? The same actor who is in the left, Negro Mama, that was part of the legal case that I mentioned before. So you just can have an idea of this representation. And this is just a slide, not about Peru, but it's about Bolivia. There is, in the area of Bolivia, Peru and Bolivia, we are sharing Titicaca Lake. So there is also a lot of representations, more very connected to slavery time. But I am not going to continue with this part. Just let me say. So it's what I can say in general is like right now our political agenda is focused on the importance of generating more evidence and more indicators about Afro-Peruvian people. because you need indicators to reform public policies. You need indicators to increase the budget from the government. No? So there are the two sides. And one of our main priorities is to train officers to include statistic questions in all the instances of the government when they need to collect information about people, like the National Survey of Health, the National Survey of Education, the National Survey against Gender Violence. So what we need is that people can ask just a question about the race and ethnicity of everybody, including Afro-Peruvian. This is something that for us is a contribution, not just for Afro-Peruvian, it's a contribution for the entire country, because we are advocating for racial indicators at all for everybody in Peru. We got something, we did a lot of advocacy to include an indicators about gender violence. No, now there is a racial indicator in some reports where people are denouncing gender violence. There was one. We, in collective with other people, we got the inclusion of Afro-Peruvians in the census. Now, this is kind of the second. What you are seeing now in the screen is one app that we designed for that, to promote that Afro-Peruvian people can recognize themselves. We did that before the census, and we were promoting this app in different communities so people can do the exercise about how they're going to answer the questions before the census.
It's very systematic, and like you said, historical patience is what's required in building the case and the evidence to really change public policy. And there are 3 questions. I just want to read them, and then the 2 of you can respond accordingly, because we only have about 8 minutes left here. Kristen Delgado asked, do the descendants of Chinese and Japanese immigrants ally with Afro-Peruvians and indigenous people, or do they reinforce the racial discrimination in Peruvian society? So that's one question. Julian Price asks, amazing poetry, exclamation point. Is there a significant difference in the initiative or content of Afro-Peruvian writing as opposed to indigenous work? So we're seeing a theme here, right? How important is writing to the separate movements within Peru? And then the last question comes from our very own Professor Hewan Girma. Thank you both for your presentation and me for translation. You're welcome. I have a question on Blackness, African identity in the Peruvian context. If I understand correctly, there is an acceptance to being called Afro-descendant, but not necessarily Black. Can you expand on this a bit? Moreover, is this related to colorism and not just racism? Also, does this present a challenge when trying to create linkages with other Afro-Latinx populations? Okay, so there's a lot there. The theme of allyship among Afro-descended and indigenous people, and then issues of colorism and why, to explain a little bit more around this racial idea. So maybe Monica, you can get us started on that.
Sure, I'm going to speak in Spanish, entonces va a ser más resumido, entonces la traducción va a ser más rápida. Bueno, se dice que en Estados Unidos hay una cultura leucocrática, ¿no? Y para nosotros es una cultura pigmentocrática. Entonces, en una misma familia de hermanos y hermanas, un hermano que es más claro de piel, a pesar de padres afro, esa persona, ese hermano, es aceptado por la sociedad de mejor manera que otros. O sea, la sociedad te fuerza a que seas y a que prestes más atención al color de piel. Entonces, en un contexto de racismo, como ven en los periódicos que mostré, donde o sea, a mí me han escupido en la cara por ser afro, muchas veces te escupen en la cara, ¿no? Te llaman mono, monkey, todo lo que te puedes imaginar. Entonces, o sea, ¿cuál es la estrategia donde podemos no pelear con las identidades, no resolver el conflicto histórico, sino hacer que la gente se sienta parte de una identidad positiva? Y eso es África y lo afrodescendiente. Entonces,
okay, so there's colorism, very clear colorism. Even, within my own family in Peru, I can identify that my mother was the darker skinned one in her family and was treated second class. So that's true across Peruvian society. There's particular viciousness towards Blackness. Monica was saying that, she's been spit in the face, in public. She's been called, various names. And so if there's a particular sort of need to engage that, and I forgot the last part of what you were saying, qué pena.
Está bien, sí. I just was saying that the strategy is connecting us with Africa is
Oh, right,
important.
that's right.
And yeah, and maybe just the idea, as I mentioned before, people here talk about abolitionismo or talk about, well, there are many categories that are more connected to the experience here. But in Peru, and I want to mention that connected to the others. So my family, we are coming from El Carmen. You have the San Jose Hacienda, and there is a tunnel, and there are catacombs. So I was raised in that context. My cousins, they are still working for the hacienda with the catacombs, where there are caves where Black people back then were punished. So it's like for us to listen to the word abolicionismo, that here is also connected with a mass incarceration. There is no sense for us, or if there is sense for me, it's connected with my own town. No, yes, of course. No, we are talking about abolition in the context that you are still having in front of you the caves where your people were there. So this is more a call to always evaluate the categories that we are using here for Blackness, if that categories make sense for us in Latin America, no?
Yeah, and just a quick thing, because the theme was coming up between sort of the tensions or the allyship between Afro-descended peoples, and I'm being careful to say Afro, because you're saying the importance of identifying with Africa as a whole as opposed to colorism and Blackness, which is an important distinction in Afro-Peruvian political organizing. But maybe Dan, you could speak to sort of the work and tensions over time between Afro-Peruvians and indigenous peoples, or the work that have brought those groups of people together, because many Afro-Peruvians are indigenous, and there's a combination, as we know, one of our organizers, Nonia Menez Garifuna, bringing those two together.
Yes, this is a really complex question that I think is difficult to answer in a few minutes. But I would respond by first recommending a couple of books. First is a book titled Pigmentocracies by sociologist Edward Telles, which does place this role of pigmentocracies in a transnational context. He compares using detailed sociological research and quantitative data through surveys to understand the reality of pigmentocracy throughout Latin America as it exists both in Peru and Brazil and Colombia, for example. And what I find really fascinating about this question of pigmentocracies, and he contextualizes it in this way as well, is it directly challenges this dominant narrative mestizaje, which presumes that racial mixing over time has erased racial difference, right? And that it's made race irrelevant, and that therefore there can be no racism. And I think Monica's examples of her personal experiences are all that much more important. And the examples that she provided in her presentation as well, of highlighting obvious examples of direct racism, right? That flies in the face of this notion of a raceless society in Peru, or anywhere in Latin America for that matter. It's something that's unique to the form of racism in Peru, that makes it really different from the forms of racism that we see in other countries in the Americas, right? The question of the distinct ethno-racial identities, especially between Chinese and Japanese immigrants who were imported in large numbers over the course of the 19th century, especially Chinese coolie laborers, with the intent of replacing the labor lost due to the abolition of slavery, is a good one. And the book I would recommend on that topic is unfortunately in Spanish, but anthropologist Humberto Rodriguez Pastor has written a book called Negritud, and it's a collection of essays and his anthropological research along the northern coast, which to a certain extent does show, generally speaking, harmonious relations and a commonality of interests, political interests, with regard to the exploitation of their labor in opposition to the landholding elite, the traditional aristocracy of Peru, which I think he makes a really important point in that book in his anthropological research. At the same time, there has been an emphasis historiographically on examples of conflict, right, between Afro-Peruvian people and indigenous and also of Chinese people in the late 19th century. So the primary example I would point to regarding that is a massacre that occurred in 1881 in the midst of the War of the Pacific between Peru and Chile, in which, according to most historical records, Afro-Peruvian women were responsible for massacring over 1,000 Chinese laborers in brutal ways. But historian Vincent Peloso has done some really great work of interrogating that narrative. I mean, showing why that narrative appealed both to the Chilean invaders during the War of the Pacific, but also why that appealed to the white Creole elites in Lima as well, who wanted to highlight their racist narratives, of course, of Afro-Peruvians as being violent and brutal, right?
Right, to reinforce that narrative. Dan, Monica, we're going to have to end it here. This has been such a rich discussion. We could go on for a long time, and hopefully we'll be able to continue this conversation in other ways. I want to thank you both for your time, your expertise, and your care. And thank everyone who attended this session and the questions from Kristen and Professor Girma and Julian. So, and of course, Dr. Morissette and Kalia and my colleagues at UNCG and in the consortium. So thank you, everybody. Have a good evening. We're going to have one more session. We're having a closeout session. So in 15 minutes, if you can do it, it'd be great to have you, okay? So come back in 15 minutes.